So welcome everybody to our first June rounds and another fellow. We sort of had our fellows, I think, kind of bunched together, but it's really exciting to hear about some of the work they've been doing and what they've been pondering as some of their fellowships wrap up. And it gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Ben Chen, who's a second-year fellow in the Infectious Diseases program here at UCSD, and he's in the clinician educator track. He went to Tulane University School of Medicine and completed residency at the University of Iowa. This year, he's been working in medical education and antimicrobial stewardship, in addition to piloting an ID division journal watch, which just from my own opinion has been really great to be able to read. Outside of medicine, he enjoys running and reading comics, not comments, comics. But maybe there'll be good comments on your talk and we can read those too later. Sorry, Ben. Anyway, I'll turn it over to you and I'll keep an eye on the chat and let you know if there's a clarification. But otherwise, I think we'll just try to spend some time at the end having a nice dialogue.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Blumenthal. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. And of course, thank you for joining me on a Friday morning, relatively early. My name is Benjamin Chen, and I'm a second-year ID fellow, first-time high rounds presenter. Thank you so much for having me. I consider myself a clinician first and foremost, but this year, when I've been off clinical service, one of the places where I like to spend my time is in ASP, which is the Antimicrobial Stewardship Program at UCSD Health. And so what I'm hoping to accomplish with this talk is to give you all a different lens, a different perspective through which to view antibiotic stewardship. We all recognize this as a very pressing concern in human health and in our healthcare system. But like I said, I want to offer just a different perspective for you all to ponder on. Okay, I have no personal or financial disclosures to share with you all. Okay, so when we talk about antibiotic resistance in humans, at least, one of the most often cited statistics is this value of 2.8 million and 35,000. Specifically, what that means is that the CDC tracks all of this data, and they note that on average, there's over 2.8 million cases of antibiotic-resistant infection per year. And that results in over 35,000 deaths per year that are attributable to antibiotic resistance in this country. Where did this data actually come from? So just to provide a little bit of context for this. So in 2013, the Centers for Disease Control published their very first ever antibiotic resistance or AR threats report. This was a landmark report in 2013 because it really gave a national sense of urgency to this issue. And it directly resulted in the 2015 U.S. National Action Plan for combating antibiotic resistance. This was a multi-step plan, multi-year plan enacted by the Obama administration to kind of act upon the recommendations that the CDC had outlined. In 2019, the CDC published the second edition of the AR Threats Report, and that's where this purple box comes from, and that's where the most up-to-date statistics come from. The second AR Threats Report subsequently resulted in the second U.S. National Action Plan for combating resistance. But then unfortunately, as we all know, the world itself fundamentally changed in 2020 and 2021. And what we know is that one of the major casualties of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we lost a lot of momentum in antibiotic stewardship, just because, in those early chaotic years of the pandemic, a lot of the efforts that had been accomplished in terms of antibiotic stewardship were all lost, when there's just so many sick people in the healthcare system. So the most up-to-date data we have is from 2019, but it'll be really, really telling when the CDC publishes the next edition of the AR Threats Report, just to see kind of where we've landed after COVID and pandemic and, all the momentum that we've lost. So, understandably, there's a lot of effort in the healthcare system, in human medicine, to kind of curb antibiotic misuse and to wisely utilize antibiotics. But, as I looked into this issue, as it turns out, that really doesn't tell the entire story of antibiotics as a whole. So in this country, more than 2/3 of all antibiotics by weight are in fact not even used in humans, but instead are used on farm settings. So more than 2/3 of all antibiotics that are manufactured in this country get used in livestock and animals, and in the farm setting, and don't even reach humans directly. So with this talk, I want to tell this story in a 3-act structure, in a literary 3-act structure. First of all, I'll explain kind of how we got here, what's the historical context, and what's the actual rationale behind the antibiotic use in the agriculture industry. Then I want to tell you all, with that in mind, what is the actual impact on human health? Share some scientific papers on that. And then finally, I want to end with, where do we go from here after I've defined the scope of the problem? What steps have been taken and what further steps need to be taken? Okay, so I'm going to start with some historical context, which I always think is really fun. So, as we understand, as we all know, after World War II, there was a baby boom in this country that led to a massive population explosion. Millions of babies were born after World War II. And then at the same time, there was a lot of kind of socioeconomic changes that were occurring concurrently. People were moving into the suburbs, they were leaving urban areas, they were leaving rural areas, and as a consequence, people were leaving really the kind of the sources of food production and the areas of food production for the suburbs. At the same time, there was a big technological shift as well in the post-war era, in which home refrigeration became affordable and widely disseminated. So not only was there a bigger population to feed, but there were also improved technologies to preserve food and to keep food around. So all of this led to basically a massive demand in the late 40s and early 50s for cheap, accessible, healthy foods, and in particular meats. So the images that I'm sharing with you on your screen right now are kind of historical footnotes as far as what did animal husbandry, what did poultry raising look like in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You see it's kind of this bucolic and idealized and almost romanticized vision of these rural families and frontier families raising backyard chickens. You can understand that at this time period, the late 19th to early 20th century, for the average American, chicken dinner is still very much a delicacy. It's a luxury that you only have a couple times per year. Families for the most part are still living in rural areas, and they're raising these animals kind of on the side for their own subsistence, maybe for selling at the local market. But for the most part, raising animals and farming at this stage is still very localized and very subsistence, like I said. When you fast forward a couple decades into the post-war period, you start to see the birth and the rise of factory farming as we understand it today, industrial farming. So this image I took from the Texas A&M University archives. And, like I said, this is kind of the emblematic and representative image of factory farming that developed for the first time in the post-war period. I know there are a lot of clinicians on this call, so, as you can imagine, suddenly you have all of these animals that are really densely housed and living in these arguably unsanitary conditions, kind of packed into these poorly ventilated factory farms where you can see there's like a lot of bird waste down here on the ground, and the birds themselves are really confined and unable to move around. You can imagine that this is really the perfect environment for the transmission of infectious disease between animals, be that viral, bacterial, or even parasitic pathogens. So with the birth and with the rise of factory farming, a lot of these factory farms then started to experiment with introducing low-dose antibiotics, really as a sense of prophylaxis to prevent, animal disease and to prevent economic loss. And this is really the first time that we start seeing this practice of low-dose antibiotics being introduced into animal feed. So continuing the historical context, I wanted to share with you some really important papers from this kind of golden age era of agricultural science. So this is a paper from 1946, and this is one of the earliest papers that I could find, if not the earliest paper I could find, that was reporting on the effects of low-dose antibiotic supplemented feed benefiting the growth and the weight gain of these animals. So like I said, the initial intention was really to introduce antibiotics into the food supply of these animals to prophylax and to prevent disease. But one of the unforeseen consequences was that these farmers and scientists found that when they introduced low-dose antibiotics into the feed, they actually got bigger and heavier and fatter animals from it. And no one really understood why. So like I said, this paper is from UW-Madison, and essentially it was an observational study in which they introduced low-dose antibiotics into the feed of poultry chickens. They tested it against different types of feed, against different supplementations as well, folate, thiamine, different vitamin supplementation. And what they found is that the chickens that received low-dose antibiotics in their feed gained weight at a much faster rate than the non-supplemented chickens. One of the secondary endpoints that they looked at was the cecal intestinal bacterial load. And what they found is that intuitively, I guess, the amount of bacteria in the chicken's intestines was much lower when they were fed these low-dose antibiotics. But at this time, at this kind of formative time in the industry, there was no hypothesis as far as the exact mechanisms as to why these birds were gaining weight. It's still kind of early on, and again, there was no hypothesis at the time. So this is fun. This is the data that they published from 1946. So I'll walk you through a couple of interesting findings here. So red arrow up top, this is the negative control. This is chickens, wild type chickens, if you will, that are being raised with like normal feed, no supplementation, no vitamins, no antibiotic supplementation. So what you can see here is that, hopefully you can all see my mouse, these chickens were gaining on average 155 grams at 4 weeks, and then they cultured the bacteria and quantified them out of the chicken's intestine. So down here, this is unopposed antibiotic supplementation, so various quantities of streptothricin, which is a cousin of streptomycin, aminoglycoside antibiotic. And so what this column here, what this skinny column here shows is that when you give unopposed antibiotics to these chickens in their feed, you just end up with a lot of dead chickens. It was like intrinsically toxic to these birds. There was minimal weight gain compared to the negative control. And like I said, there was just a bunch of dead chickens. And so what they found is that when you supplement these antibiotics at various concentrations with vitamins, particularly folic acid, you end up with no dead chickens, and then you end up with this massive weight gain. So anywhere from 1.5 to 2 times the weight gain compared to the negative control. And again, this is from 1946. This was an observational study, but there's really no hypothesis. The paper is only about like 2 pages long, minus the references, and there's really no kind of hypothesis as far as why this is happening. It was just like a very incidental and very cool finding, if you will, that really benefited the agriculture and livestock industry of the time. This is another paper from this kind of early era, from the formative era. This is from 1953. And this was a paper specifically looking at the growth promoting effects of oreomycin on various diet types again, for chickens. Oreomycin is the trade name for chlortetracycline. I didn't know this, but chlortetracycline was actually the very first tetracycline antibiotic that was discovered all the way back in 1945. I don't think this is used in humans. Chlortetracycline is only used in animals. But in the modern sense of the word, this would be what's considered an industry-sponsored study, because the same company that discovered chlortetracycline also did this research analysis as far as the benefits of chlortetracycline in supplementing bird feed. So once again, this group looked at the benefit of supplementing different types of feed, different carbohydrate-based feeds with this antibiotic, and they looked at the weight gain from the chickens themselves. There was another secondary endpoint that they reported on, which was that antibiotic supplemented feed would increase the gut transit time of these birds, basically increase the time between feeding and stooling in these birds. But once again, just like in the previous paper, this is primitive stuff, and there's really no hypothesis as far as what's the significance of this finding. So, all right, once again, I want to show you some old data on this because I think it's super fun. So what you see here on the left is you have different types of carbohydrate-based feeds, like starch-based feed, sucrose-based feed, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have various weight gains charted at 3 weeks. And so what I've highlighted here on your screen is that regardless of the kind of carbohydrate that the chickens are being fed, the addition of oreomycin or chlortetracycline, to use the the non-trade name, resulted in substantial weight gain that they attributed to it. So compared to the control birds that were receiving no antibiotic feed, they were finding that these birds were gaining anywhere from 20 to 60 odd grams within just 3 weeks when they were fed these low-dose antibiotics. So again, this was one of the kind of early Wild West papers, from the late 1940s to 1950s that showed that there was this really marked benefit to antibiotic supplementation. Okay, so fast forward a couple decades. This was a really nice narrative review paper I found, Howe et al. From 2014, and they really did a deep dive into the literature, into the scientific literature, and their paper really guided a lot of my research for this talk. But they summarized a couple key ways that were elucidated as far as what the actual mechanism is for animal growth from antibiotic supplementation. I've categorized them myself into microbiologic, anatomical, and immunologic factors. So microbiologically, as intuitively makes sense, low-dose antibiotics would reduce the colonization of GI bacteria in various livestock animals, and of course inhibit the growth of pathogens. Anatomically, this was rather interesting, but in a lot of autopsy studies and post-mortem studies, a lot of groups found that low-dose antibiotic supplementation would actually decrease the thickness of the intestinal mucosa, kind of like blunt the intestinal villi, and therefore increase the transit of nutrients across the gut wall, basically making the birds more efficient at extracting nutrients from food. And then finally, this one was really interesting. From an immunologic standpoint, just the addition of low-dose antibiotics over time would essentially inhibit the host's immune response. They found that it would decrease the mass of the thymus and other lymphoid tissues, and essentially lower the overall amount of systemic inflammation, therefore allowing birds to, and not just birds, but animals to gain weight faster because there was this lower level of underlying inflammation. So, I found all these papers to be really interesting. But another interesting point that I want to emphasize here is that, the widespread use of antibiotic feed in the livestock industry started really in the 1940s and 50s, but it wasn't until multiple decades later that scientists actually figured out where the benefit came from. So there was this huge lag between the adoption of this new practice and then really understanding the practice itself. And so, I think that's really important to emphasize because, imagine if there was like a new great wonder drug that gets developed now, and suddenly there's widespread adoption in healthcare, but we don't understand how it works. It's almost like alien to think that such a practice could be so widely disseminated, despite the fact that the mechanisms themselves weren't fully understood until, arguably decades later. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward again. So we went from the post-war period into the 60s and 70s. Now I'm going to fast forward to 2021. So the data that you see here on your screen is adopted from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which is the single organization in this country that has authority to monitor antibiotic sales within the agriculture industry. So as you can see here in this bold section, there's about 6 million square kilos of medically important antibiotics that were used in 2021, specifically within livestock. What I want to emphasize here is that, based on all the historical footnotes that I gave you, 2/3 of all of that still remains to this day tetracyclines, based on those early 1940s and 1950s studies. And then on this figure over here on the right, what I want to emphasize is that nearly 2/3 of that 6 million square kilos of antibiotics are still being used strictly in terms of feed, not necessarily for therapeutic purposes, but for the practice of growth supplementation. And so again, that's a direct consequence of these early studies. That's a direct consequence of what people found at that time. And I just want to emphasize that this is still very much an active practice within the livestock industry to this day. Okay, so that was Act 1. How did we get here? I think there's a chat here. Let me just, today's Act. Okay, cool. All right, so that's Act 1 here. So hopefully I've convinced you, how we got here, why it was important, what was the groundbreaking science that allowed us to get here. So now I want to convince you of, now that we know the scope of the problem, what exactly is the impact on human health, and why should we care as clinicians? So I'm going to round up a very curated selection of scientific papers here, hopefully to make a case for you as far as why this is important. Okay, so this is a 2009 paper from a veterinarian group, which was specifically looking at this very cool metagenomic approach for looking at the prevalence of resistance genes in animal poop, essentially. So this study took place on this commercial feedlot somewhere out in Nebraska, in which there were essentially two cohorts of cows. This was a cow cohort study. One cohort of cows was conventionally raised, which means that they were fed antibiotic supplemented feed, and then one cohort of cows were fed antibiotic free feed. The authors note that these cows were separated physically on different parts of the feedlot so that there was no kind of cross eating of their food, and there was no interaction of the cows between each other. So the investigators collected random stool samples from these different cows, and then essentially took all of this poop and then sequenced it, specifically looking at 14 different tetracycline resistance genes, and looking at the prevalence of these resistance genes within the two different populations of cows. And so what you see here on your screen is the kind of the prevalence of these resistance genes per stool sample. Conventionally raised cattle up top, antimicrobial free cattle on the bottom. A couple interesting things to point here. So, low-level tetracycline resistance is very much still present within even these antimicrobial free cattle. And, at 5 to 6 genes, 7 to 8 genes, it actually looks like the antimicrobial free cattle have more prevalence of tetracycline resistance than the cows that are being exposed to it. But then at the far end over here, like greater than or equal to 11 targets, it's pretty unequivocal that high level of tetracycline resistance is certainly much more prevalent within these antibiotic raised cattle. And so, this kind of makes intuitive sense, right? It's it's not really shocking results here that, if you expose cows to a certain kind of antibiotic, over time, their bacterial flora are going to develop resistance to that target. So, it's not necessarily shocking data here. But what I do want to point out is that these investigators specifically chose these 14 tetracycline resistance genes out of the, I don't know, hundreds, maybe dozens, if not hundreds of tetracycline resistance genes that are known, specifically because these 14 genes are all carried on plasmids. So there's kind of raises the risk of some sort of horizontal transmission with these genes. So, the significance of having these resistance markers within the flora of these cows has bigger implications, just because these are genes that are known to horizontally transmit. Yeah. Oops. Okay. So this is another study that I want to directly follow up with compared to the last one. So this is a 2009 paper that was was conducted by this Canadian group here. And this was really interesting. So this was a cross-sectional study of 90 swine finishing farms in the province of Alberta, Canada. The image that you see on your screen here, this is an example of a swine finishing farm. So basically, in the process of raising pigs for slaughter or for selling at market, the finishing farm is essentially the last step in the adolescent pigs process before they're either slaughtered or they're sold to market. So this is like a very nutritionally intensifying state. This is a really like calorically intensifying state to essentially fatten up the pigs. So they're getting a lot of food at this stage, and they're getting a lot of antibiotic exposure again at this state, because economically it's a very critical time in the chain. So this group was looking at 90 of these finishing farms in Alberta, and from these farms, they pooled random fecal isolates, 5 of them per farm, so 450 total fecal isolates. And then from there, rather than doing a genotypic approach, they did a phenotypic approach. They cultured the stool for bacteria, and then from the bacteria, they did susceptibility testing to 15 different medically important antibiotics using the broth microdilution method. And so what they were looking at was, was there any correlation between antimicrobial use of any class within the pig's life versus any sort of antibiotic resistance. And so what they did was they surveyed the farms themselves as far as, what kind of antimicrobials were they using, and then through what method were they being introduced, whether that's through feed, through water, or direct injection into the pigs. Okay, so this is a bit of a busy slide, but let me walk you through this. So AMU, that's antimicrobial use, risk factor variables associated with AMR, that's antimicrobial resistance in E. coli, odds ratios, confidence intervals, and p-values here. And so what I want to emphasize here with these red bars is that what we're looking at is what are the risk factors down here to predicting ampicillin resistance. And so what they found is that ampicillin resistance was actually, phenotypic ampicillin resistance, I should say, was actually associated with the use of any kind of antibiotic supplementation within the food. So not just ampicillin itself, but if you expose these pigs to any sort of antibiotics within their food, there was a highly statistically significant association with developing ampicillin resistance, odds ratio of almost 3, significant confidence interval and p-value. This finding was replicated in streptomycin as well. So streptomycin resistance was associated with any sort of antibiotic feed that was introduced to these pigs in their lifetime. Odds ratio of 3.9. Sulfasoxazole, this is a sulfa drug, as you can imagine. Again, this is associated with any sort of antibiotic exposure within the food. And then the last one, again, it's kind of intuitive, but tetracycline resistance was associated with any sort of tetracycline exposure within the food. Odds ratios of 14 and 18, kind of corroborating the previous study that I showed you, that metagenomic study. So I thought this paper was pretty telling, just in the sense that beyond the intuitive exposure leads to resistance, this is kind of showing that there's additional factors at play, that there's cross resistance that happens when these animals are being exposed to any sort of antimicrobial. And again, the implications of this are definitely much bigger than from the previous paper. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you all now that the addition of antibiotics into feed causes pretty widespread resistance patterns within the animals themselves. But now we have to make the leap of, do the resistance patterns in these animals that come from the feed cross over and translate into resistance patterns seen in humans? And so this is a really fun paper that I found all the way back from 1978. This is from a gentleman, Dr. Levy, at Tufts University in Boston. And so what Dr. Levy did was he looked at this one farm, a single chicken farm out in rural Massachusetts, looking at 325 chickens at the time. This is, again, a kind of a chicken cohort study. So half of the chickens received antibiotic supplemented feed, half of the chickens received antibiotic-free feed. And then he looked at the family that was living on this farm with the chickens, so a total of 8 humans. He looked at rural controls, which were essentially neighbors of this farm, but weren't exactly people that were directly exposed to these chickens. And then finally, he looked at an urban control group, which was a group of Tufts medical students who provided their feces. And so he cultured the stool of all of these different subjects, basically the birds themselves, the family that was living with the birds, the neighbors of these farmers, and then a random group of Tufts medical students, and cultured the bacteria, cultured the stool of all of these individuals, and then looked at the resistance profiles within the bacteria. So I thought that was kind of some like fun old school science there. We'll see what the results are. Okay, so once again, so 3 different groups: farm family, local neighbors out in the rural Massachusetts, and then Tufts medical students all the way out in Boston. Number of subjects here, and the number of stool samples that were collected from all of these different groups. And so once again, they're looking at what is the prevalence of tetracycline resistance within these bacterial populations. And not unexpectedly, as you can see here, almost a third of the farm family had complete resistance to tetracycline antibiotics in their stool bacteria. Compared to the urban control back in Boston, only 3% of these students had some sort of tetracycline resistance. What's interesting is that in this intermediary group, in the local neighbors out in rural Massachusetts, their stool microbiota is not directly, it's not nothing like it is in the Boston control group. But again, it's not as high as these farmers who are directly interacting with these chickens. So this paper led to a lot of kind of interesting speculation, interesting postulation. Essentially, why is it that these people living near the farm itself but are not interacting with these birds don't necessarily have zero resistance? So Dr. Levy postulated that perhaps there's an environmental mechanism to this transmission. So we can understand that, the family that's living directly with these birds, they're, directly interacting with them, perhaps they're eating them, they're acquiring resistance from from the chickens. This is kind of intuitive, but, why is it that people living even within the neighborhood, within, a couple miles radius, are also developing this resistance? So, Dr. Levy postulated that potentially there's an environmental link here, whether it's antibiotics leaching into the water supply, whether it's, stool feces that's drying on the ground and then aerosolizing when a breeze blows by, who knows? Whether there's antibiotic residue that leaches into the environment, again, who knows? But it certainly led to a lot of postulation here. Another couple interesting findings that they report on here is that they noted, so once again, they're also culturing the stool of the birds themselves, not just the human subject. So they note that, within 36 hours of exposure to this antibiotic supplemented feed, all of the chicken intestinal bacteria had become tetracycline resistant. Okay, that's kind of intuitive again, because these birds are being fed tetracycline supplemented feed. They note that after 2 months of receiving the supplemented feed, more than a fifth of all the chicken intestinal E. coli had actually developed resistance to non-tetracycline antibiotics. And then within 4 months of starting this supplemented feeding, more than a third of the farm family's intestinal E. coli had greater than or equal to 3 antibiotic resistances. So once again, this is kind of leading to some broader implications here, that there's some element of cross-resistance that occurs even when only 1 antibiotic is being used to supplement these feeds. So, once again, the implications of this study are pretty far-reaching, I would say, and again, quite, I guess, progressive, quite forward-thinking for a paper from 1978. Okay, so that's my kind of curated selection of papers here. So one thing I do want to point out, though, as far as the scientific evidence base for these harms is, I did a pretty deep literature dive on looking at all these papers and looking at, different links of transmission between antibiotic use on the farm and then human illness downstream. And the fact of the matter is there's really not a robust evidence base here. There's no randomized controlled trials that can definitively show a link between, antibiotic exposure on the farm and then human illness in healthcare. And I'm just going to editorialize here, kind of postulate here. I think this is for 2 reasons, really. So one, of course, it's not really morally ethical to expose human subjects to potentially resistant bacteria for the purposes of a trial. I think we can all agree on that. So, in that regard, it's really difficult to make, to power randomized controlled trials to show that disease is being linked from, animals to humans. So that's one kind of hypothesis I have. And then the second is just the fact that, in this country, most farms are privately owned and commercial operations. So therefore, it's extremely difficult and challenging for scientists to get out onto farms and to do soil and water and stool testing, on private property, essentially. So, what we're left with is just a lot of this kind of like correlation, cohort, and ecological studies showing links between antibiotic exposure and resistance, showing links between, human transmission. But again, there's really no kind of robust RCT that can demonstrate that, this is actually happening. So I just want to plant that seed in your mind as well. We'll revisit that thought kind of later on in this talk. Okay, so that's just a very small sampling of the scientific literature as far as this topic is concerned. I wish that I could show you like a dozen more papers. I feel like this topic could be made into like a multi-day lecture series because there's just so much evidence out there from like an ecologic and correlation standpoint. But these are kind of the most robust like mechanistic papers that I wanted to share with you. Let me just open up the chat real quick. Yes, yeah, no, I definitely agree. Yeah, so yeah, definitely. Yeah, that there's a human harm, absolutely, and that humans were being colonized with resistant bacteria. Yep, no, totally agree with that. I just wish that there was like even more robust, like randomized controlled trials that we could use to like show that feeding these birds antibiotics in their feed was causing, resistant infection, not just colonization. But again,
we always want to we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. We have to have like 10 randomized controlled trials to prove the obvious, which is something that is kind of, interesting and sometimes keeps us from moving forward, because we say, well, this is obviously true, but we have to prove it in 10 different ways that are, unethical and not practical, and therefore nothing will change.
Oh, no, so that is 100% true, and I'm going to put a pin in that, and we'll circle back around to that thought. Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Aldis. Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that a little bit more downstream of the talk. Okay, more chats. Okay, cool. Yes. All right. Okay.
I'll keep an eye. You keep going. We can come back to that.
Yeah, we'll circle around to that thought very shortly. Okay, so all right, so hopefully I've shown you why antibiotic exposure is scary, why it's important, why it matters to human health. So now I'm going to go into the last act of this 3-act structure. Where do we go from here? And this is where things get rather interesting. Okay, so in 1969, in Great Britain, we saw this landmark SWAN report, which was essentially a joint committee specifically investigating the use of antibiotics in veterinary medicine and in the livestock industry. This was presented to the British Parliament in 1969, chaired by Dr. Michael Swan, who's a microbiologist. And the reason this paper is important is because this was really the first time that there was national attention, a national spotlight that was on this topic. Specifically, what are the harms and what are the steps that need to be taken to curb indiscriminate antibiotic usage in the animal industry. If you want to read this SWAN report, it's only about like 90 pages. It's available as a PDF in its entirety, courtesy of the Wellcome Institute online. So I picked out some of the really choice findings that Dr. Swan touched on from this report. And again, this is from 1969, and it's like a surprisingly progressive and surprisingly kind of pro-regulatory recommendation that they outline. So, we recommend that, chlortetracycline, oxytetracycline should only be given with a prescription. We recommend that penicillin should only be given with a prescription in animals. We recommend that tylosin, that's a macrolide, should not be available without a prescription for use in animals. We recommend that therapeutic antibiotics and basically anything that's not being used for feed, once again, should be prescribed by a veterinarian, by a licensed medical professional. And, we recommend that we should not be advertising therapeutic antibiotics to the layman, again, without the use of prescription. So, again, this is from 1969, and I feel like there are a lot of modern corollaries to these statements that we're still struggling with in this country, at least. And again, this is like surprisingly progressive, surprisingly pro-regulatory stuff from a while back. So now I'm going to give you a timeline really quickly, a bit of a compare and contrast here. As far as, given everything I've told you, what have been the steps taken from the European community as well as the American community, and hopefully we can learn some lessons from maybe both sides and kind of see what the history has told us. Okay, so in 1969, I just shared with you the SWAN report. So this was the landmark first ever kind of national government attention that was placed on the use of antibiotics within the agriculture industry. So really, really significant for the time, but did it actually make any sort of legislative changes? And fortunately, the answer is yes. So it was only 2 years later in 1971 that the Parliament actually banned the use of penicillin and tetracycline in Great Britain, specifically for the use as growth promoters. And so, the SWAN report was, in fact, a big success at the time because it actually resulted in some legislative action. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of these Scandinavian countries then became highly concerned with this issue as well and started enacting their own bans. In 1986, Sweden was the very first country in the world to enact a national ban on the use of all antibiotics as growth-promoting feed. And this was, again, very progressive and very important landmark in 1986. In 1995, Denmark created the very first ever government-funded animal-human resistance surveillance network. This is called DANMAP. And so this is essentially this government agency that specifically is tasked with tracking resistance patterns both in humans and in livestock. DANMAP is essentially the best source for ecologic / correlation studies in the world, because they have the most robust ability to, test on soil, test on water, test on animals themselves to look at resistance patterns, and then also correlate that with the data that they have from their nationalized healthcare system. So the DANMAP network is extremely powerful. And again, it launched all the way back in 1995. And all of this really culminated in 2006, as you may or may not remember from 2006. The EU actually issued an entire continental-wide ban on antibiotic use as growth promoters. And so this is really interesting, because in the official statement from the European Union, they acknowledged that there are data gaps and there are knowledge gaps, as I had alluded to previously, that we don't have RCTs to show that antibiotic use on the farm directly causes human disease in healthcare. But what they do acknowledge is that this legislative effort was really taken out of precautionary principle. And I think that's super important to emphasize. They were concerned enough, as we are in this conference right now, they were concerned enough with the data as it stood that they wanted to take a kind of preemptive measure before the antibiotic apocalypse truly became uncontrollable. And I think that's really admirable, and I think that's really impressive that they were able to do that all the way back in 2006. So that's kind of the European story. I'm going to compare and contrast that now to the American story. So Swan Report, 1969. 1977, then FDA Commissioner Dr. Donald Kennedy, also a microbiologist, introduced his own proposal to ban penicillins and tetracyclines as growth promoters in this country. Unfortunately, he was met with essentially immediate industry backlash from the livestock industry, basically claiming that there was really no data to support this. This was, unconstitutional kind of regulation on corporate interests. And unfortunately, Dr. Kennedy's proposal was actually rejected by Congress. And essentially, no additional legislation was introduced for almost 30 years thereafter. In 2003, Congresswoman Louise Slaughter proposed the first bill, and like I said, in almost 30 years, that would limit the use of antibiotics in the agricultural industry. I want to point out that Representative Slaughter, before her entry into government, was actually a career microbiologist and public health official before she entered Congress. So, of course, she was probably the most qualified person in government to make this proposal. Unfortunately, she was unsuccessful in 2003 when she introduced this legislation, and she was unsuccessful again in 2005 and 2007, again, because of a lot of industry lobbyists and a lot of industry backlash to her proposal. It wasn't until 2009 that the FDA finally achieved mandatory reporting for the use of antibiotics within the agriculture industry. This is the data that I was showing you earlier on in the slide, in this presentation. So the FDA has been tracking the sales of antimicrobials in the agriculture industry every single year since 2009. But this is a relatively recent development as compared to Europe's history. And then finally, in 2017, the FDA passed probably their first major step forward, which is called Guidance for Industry, or GFI number 213. This was essentially a voluntary guideline that they provided to the industry for the voluntary removal of growth promoters from feed. And so, as you can expect, there was a lot of kind of disappointment and a lot of criticism from the scientific and public health community in that essentially this legislation had no teeth. You can't even call it legislation, it's kind of guidance. Had no teeth as far as enforcement and regulation. But this was unfortunately the first major step that we had in almost 40 years since the first proposal. So in 2021, the FDA released their next guideline for industry, GFI number 263, so they released GFIs for a lot of different issues in the industry, but this is the next pertinent one to our discussion here. Which was essentially a voluntary, once again, agreement to require veterinarian prescription for the use of all over-the-counter antibiotics. And so this was another step forward. It was part of the FDA's 5-year plan to support ASP within the agriculture industry. But once again, this is a lot of disappointment, a lot of criticism to this policy, because once again, this was a voluntary guidance for drug manufacturers to require prescriptions for use of antibiotics. Again, recall that Dr. Swan made this proposal all the way back in 1969 in Great Britain. To give you the most up-to-date development in this, within just a couple weeks now, within 2 weeks or so, is going to be the deadline for the FDA's requiring of labeling that antibiotics require veterinary prescription. So that's kind of the latest and greatest update that I can provide for you as of this month of 2023. And the guideline for industry is supposed to influence lincomycin. This is a cousin of clindamycin, oxytetracycline, which we've talked about a lot, penicillin, which is huge, sulfa drugs, and then tylosin, which is a macrolide antibiotic. So, this is I guess, as good of a step forward as we have at this time. And like I said, this is rapidly approaching. So hopefully we'll see some good coming from that. I have a couple more minutes left. I'm going to jump once again back to that FDA data sheet just to give you kind of some closing thoughts and to give you one last look at the data. So as I said, the FDA tracks annual antimicrobial sales since 2009. And so this is a snapshot of the last 10 years of antibiotic use within the agriculture industry. So some good news for you is that, within the last 10 years, as you can see on this bar graph, there's been almost a 1/3 reduction in the total antibiotic sales within the agriculture industry, which is fantastic. As you can see, the bar graph kind of levels off in the last several years. And unfortunately, between 2020 and 2021, there was essentially no change in total antibiotic sales as tracked by the FDA. So there's a lot of progress since 2015, which was the peak year for antibiotic usage, but it looks like in the last maybe 3 or 4 years, there's been really no additional changes as far as antibiotic sales. I want to give a more granular view of the data. Sorry, this slide is a bit of a migraine here, but I'm just going to direct you to the last columns over here on the right. So over here, this is that 1% change that I was referring to between 2020 and 2021. This gray bar here is the total weight and volume of antibiotic sales per year. And yeah, once again, this is like that very negligible change from 2020 to 2021. But when you actually look at the individual antibiotic classes that are being sold, there's actually some very concerning trends here in that the use of lincosamides, that's like clindamycin, macrolides, and sulfa drugs is actually increasing year by year. So perhaps that 1% change, less than 1% change, doesn't necessarily tell the full story. And very clearly, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of reduce the use of antimicrobials in the agriculture industry. Okay, 8:49. So as promised, I wanted to leave some time for discussion at the end. What did I learn from doing this literature review and from doing this presentation? So we've kind of talked about we still don't have the study that shows that parachutes work, right? And so we don't have RCTs that show that this is an issue and that antibiotic exposure on the farm is causing human disease. Intuitively, I think we all understand that this is a huge issue, and intuitively all understand that something needs to be done about this. But unfortunately, I think one of the major themes of the regulatory history in this country is that without this definitive evidence base, a lot of the legislation has been opposed, rather abruptly and opposed rather strongly by the industry. And so, we all intuitively understand that this is a big issue, but perhaps the legislation is lagging until we're able to show with robust data and with robust trials that this is in fact an issue. It's unfortunate, I would say. Again, the European Union had this very progressive and proactive approach to this problem, even without the evidence there. And so it's unfortunate that the US hasn't been able to follow that kind of same history. And then the other big question that I had, other big takeaway that I had is, what is actually the role of government oversight here? Because at the heart of American regulation has always been this conflict between, corporate autonomy and public health, right? We saw this exact same battle over tobacco. We saw the same battle over high fructose corn syrup and obesity. I kind of wish that we took a more proactive and progressive approach like the European Union did, but like I said, perhaps we just need to get some more data before we can really push this legislation through. That's all I'm going to say about that. Kind of unfortunate, but yeah, I want to hear from everyone else now. And I guess I'll open up this little chat box over here.
Yeah, there was a lot of comments
Cool.
and people just sort of saying things. I don't know if someone would like to, I mean, there are a few people saying a lot of things. And if Michael, Shannon, Tom, you have comments.
I was just noting that the that bar graph with the purple bars that you were showing, Ben, it kind of looked like there could have just been like a pre-2016 rate and a post-2016 rate of sales. And I was just wondering if you came across there was something major that happened in 2016 that explains that, you know, because you were kind of pointing out it's been pretty steady since 2016, and I think maybe it was kind of pretty steady before it also. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the guideline for industry was it rolled out entirely in 2017, but the actual decision was released to the public in 2016. So maybe you could argue that there was some impact from that guidance for industry number 213 that the FDA released. And unfortunately, we don't actually have like regulatory data because once again, this is a voluntary kind of agreement between the FDA and industry. So we don't know how many companies actually signed on to this, but you know, hopefully the bar graph here shows that something good did come out of it in 2017, as you noted.
Ben, Tom asks, is there epidemiologic evidence that lifetime vegetarians have less resistance?
Oh man, that's an awesome question. I can't cite a paper off the top of my head, but I think that the answer is probably somewhere within DanMap, like looking at
That's what Mike
network.
So Mike wrote.
Yeah, but that's a really good question. So you know, if you're not even exposed to the meats at all, perhaps you're less colonized with these resistant organisms. Yeah, that's a great point.
But we don't necessarily think this is eating cooked meat necessarily. So if we're talking about environmental contamination, then you wouldn't necessarily get that out of the vegetarian. You know, it'd be interesting to kind of divide that up to see if you think that this is coming from the soil or from, you know, other humans who are working on the farms and their stool contaminating other things, you know, where that's coming from. So I think vegetarians should be looked at, but not necessarily assumed that they would not be colonized.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. There's a lot of environmental pathways for these transmissions to occur. Yeah, soil, water, you know, feces from people working on farms. So yeah, absolutely.
I had a follow-up, Ben. I'll be interested to hear your opinion on the legislation, and that is that this is in defense of America, and that is that I think in general the populace don't want to take antibiotics, and so in a pure capitalistic society, that means giving them the information to make that choice. And so, is the issue in labeling, and could that be something that FDA could do without congressional approval?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think that speaks to this newest 263 here. So yeah, this is like essentially a labeling agreement to slap a label on all these over-the-counter antibiotics so that, you know, farmers and corporate farms aren't able to buy these products without the prescription.
I was thinking of consumer labeling.
Oh,
so the actual end consumer, so that the people that buy the meat can say, I don't believe in antibiotic-fed meat, in the similar way that GMO is very unpopular in some countries. And so just giving the consumer information is the power for change in the US. And so that's my question.
Sure. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood. Yeah, so no, absolutely. I think people vote with their dollar in this country. Like you said, it's a capitalistic society and people make their viewpoints heard with their dollar. You know, there is some labeling, you know, just anecdotally speaking at the grocery store, you know, this meat was raised without antibiotics, but as far as I'm aware, there's not like an actual agreement between the FDA and industry to have that yet. It's just, you know, I think it's probably meat companies trying to increase their profits by tapping into what's popular at the moment with consumers to provide that label.
Then Alan McCutcheon, oh, there's so much coming through. Alan had asked, have studies compared organically raised to antibiotic exposed animals for prevalence of resistant fecal microbes?
Yeah, so One of the papers was, or yeah, a couple of these papers were looking at like, yeah, conventionally raised versus antibiotic free. So yeah, these are kind of like correlation studies, I suppose, from back in the day, looking at what the colonization rate is with these resistant microbes. I will say again that, probably smaller N, these calves were ostensibly raised on like separate parts of the feedlot, but there's always a question like, oh, is there some sort of cross-contamination? Is there some sort of, environmental transmission? So, I wish it could be done under like a scientific lab kind of environment to show that there's difference in the microbiota between organic versus antibiotic raised animals.
I was looking for just a broader sampling of organic, if you will, rather than this specific one site antibiotic-free group for comparison. In other words, what do we know if we sample or has somebody sampled multiple organically raised animals for that prevalence?
Okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, not that I could find, I guess, leading up to this. I think that would be a really powerful study, but once again, it's one of the barriers is that a lot of the science can't really happen at the point of animal raising, just because so many of these farms are like corporate raised, and it's hard to get onto the farms to do this kind of sampling. And one of the interesting papers I didn't share with you, but that I reviewed in this literature review was that one of these investigators in Arizona was like specifically going to grocery stores, buying up like all the chicken and poultry that they could find in the grocery store, and then like just doing testing on the surface of the meat to look for differences in resistance. And there was in fact a difference, but that's at the very, very end point, like consumer point within the chain.
I guess, Ben, excellent talk. Fascinating, and that's why there's so much active discussion. I apologize for being provocative, because I do believe also that we should ban these. There's just really no good reason if they're doing this in Europe. But I don't know. I do take sort of I try to make the point that we get a lot more bang for our buck with hospital stewardship, obviously, because this is where sort of the end result of all this is, and we watch people evolve to get resistance in the hospital and on antibiotics. I think that when we do these public health sort of interventions, it's a small effect, but over a wide area and huge population. So there is definitely benefit. But to the comments about, oh, we're doing so much and the corporations aren't doing, I just don't know that the direct consequences, I think, on human health are obviously more critical what we're doing than, say, or they're more obvious, than sort of the other stuff.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I appreciate that, Dr. Dice. Yeah, hopefully what I was able to accomplish is just to introduce like these One Health principles. And that's like a very trending topic right now in public health, which is, animal health, human health, environmental health. It's all the same thing. So hopefully it's just like a different framework to think about things. But yeah, your point is certainly valid. Yeah, I agree.
This is Alan McCutcheon again. Along the same lines, I wondered if the Europeans had seen any decrease in human-resistant infections after their EU-wide ban on antibiotics in feed.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. McCutcheon. Yeah, so the answer to that is definitely within DanMap. So yeah, I think Shannon actually linked one of the papers from the DanMap network. So yeah, they actually, in Denmark, they saw a huge decline in human VRE infection after the ban occurred on antibiotic supplementation in feed. And so, we can acknowledge that, again, this is like an ecological / like correlation study, but there was definitely a decrease in VRE infection in Denmark after the ban occurred.
All right, well, it's 9 o'clock. I think a lot of people are saying it's very surprising this hasn't been studied more, and I will be the negative Nancy here, or whatever we call that person now, and say I think it's not a surprise because corporations rule. And capitalism is our world. But it's nice that we're starting to see more presentations like this, and you know, maybe we'll see some shift over time. This was fascinating, Ben. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'll
And
also do-
congrats on nearly graduating.
Oh,
All
thank you.
right, we'll see everyone. That's funny. Sorry, I'm just looking at that. All right, we'll see everyone next week. Nice job.
Thank you.